Carmen, I specifically requested pre-boarding privileges. Why are we standing in this cattle line like common passengers? Victoria Pemberton Wells didn't whisper the complaint. She announced it, her voice cutting through the bustling atmosphere of JFK Terminal 4 like a knife through silk. At 48, Victoria carried herself with the practiced arrogance of someone who had never heard the word no without immediately calling a lawyer. Her cream Chanel blazer cost more than most people's monthly rent, and the Louis Vuitton rolling case behind her had never touched anything rougher than marble floors. Standing beside her, Carmen Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably, juggling 3 passports, a venti iced coffee that was rapidly becoming lukewarm, and Victoria's cashmere wrap. At 26, Carmen had been Victoria's assistant for 18 months, long enough to recognize the warning signs of an impending meltdown, but not long enough to know how to prevent one. The gate agent said there was a slight delay with the cleaning crew. Ms. Pemberton Wells, Carmen stammered, glancing nervously at the growing line behind them at gate B12. They're boarding first class now. Victoria scoffed, adjusting her oversized Dior sunglasses despite being indoors. The gesture was performative, designed to signal her displeasure to anyone within a 50-foot radius. She had perfected this particular brand of entitled fury over decades of getting her way through sheer force of will and family money. About time, she muttered, bypassing the 2 families waiting patiently in the priority boarding lane. She flashed her platinum elite boarding pass with the theatrical flourish of someone waving a royal decree. The gesture caught the attention of other passengers, some of whom recognized her from business magazines or society pages. Behind the desk, the gate agent, a woman named Lisa Chen, who had dealt with difficult passengers for 15 years, offered a tight professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. Welcome back, Ms. Pemberton Wells. Flight 847 to London Heathrow. Seat 1A, as always. It better be, Victoria snapped, snatching the boarding stub with enough force to crumple it. Last time the champagne was lukewarm, and the Wi-Fi was practically dial-up speed. I have a crucial merger meeting in London that could determine the future of Sterling Pharmaceuticals. I expect better service today. She marched toward the jet bridge, her heels clicking against the terminal floor like gunshots. Each step was measured, deliberate, designed to announce her presence to everyone in her path. This was her domain, her ritual, her sanctuary in the sky. Flight 847 to London was more than transportation. It was her mobile office, her escape from the mounting pressures of keeping her family's pharmaceutical empire afloat. Carmen hurried behind, struggling to keep up while managing Victoria's various belongings. She had learned early in her employment that Victoria's pre-flight ritual was sacred. Any disruption, any deviation from the established pattern would result in hours of complaints and demands for explanations that Carmen couldn't provide. The car will meet us at Heathrow. Victoria continued, not bothering to look back at her assistant. I want the merger documents printed and bound before we reach the hotel. The Meridian Pharmaceutical presentation needs to be perfect. This deal will save us Carmen. Sterling needs this partnership more than they know. What Victoria didn't mention, what she had carefully hidden from her board, her family, and even Carmen, was just how desperately Sterling Pharmaceuticals needed this merger. 3 failed FDA approvals in the last year had devastated their stock price. Competitors were circling like vultures. Her father, Richard Pemberton, had made it clear that this London meeting was her last chance to prove she deserved her executive position. The pressure had been building for months, turning Victoria's natural arrogance into something sharper, more desperate. Every interaction had become a power struggle, every perceived slight a personal attack on her authority. She had started taking sleeping pills to manage the stress prescription anxiety medication to get through board meetings and increasing doses of both to maintain the facade of control. As they approached the aircraft door, Victoria inhaled deeply. The familiar scent of recycled air and expensive leather welcomed her like an old friend. This was her space, her throne, her temporary kingdom at 35,000 feet. Seat 1. It wasn't just a seat, it was a statement of power, a symbol of her place in the world's hierarchy. She had flown this exact route 53 times in the past 3 years. Every flight attendant knew her preferences. Room temperature, champagne, extra lime, no small talk. The bulkhead seat on the left side offered maximum legroom privacy and the psychological satisfaction of being literally first. It was hers by right, by payment, by precedent. "Thank you," Carmen Victoria said, finally acknowledging her assistant's existence as they reached the aircraft door. "Find your seat in economy. I'll need those documents ready for review before we land." Carmen nodded, used to the dismissal, but something in Victoria's voice today seemed different, tighter, more strained than usual. As Victoria disappeared into the first-class cabin, Carmen couldn't shake the feeling that her boss was walking into something she wasn't prepared for. Victoria stepped through the aircraft door, immediately turning left toward the premium cabin. She nodded curtly at the flight attendant standing near the galley, a young woman she didn't recognize, and moved purposefully toward row 1. This was her moment of transition from the chaos of the terminal to the controlled environment where she belonged. She rounded the corner into the first-class cabin, expecting to see her familiar leather sanctuary waiting empty and pristine. Instead, she stopped dead in her tracks. Someone was sitting in seat 1A. Victoria blinked hard, as if the image in front of her might dissolve through sheer force of will. But it didn't. There, settled comfortably in the wide leather recliner that she considered her personal property, sat a black man who appeared to be in his late 40s. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal turtleneck and tailored dark slacks that spoke of expensive taste and careful attention to detail. Rimless glasses perched on his nose as he read what appeared to be a thick hardcover book on architectural history. A glass of sparkling water sat on the armrest beside him, and everything about his posture suggested a man completely at ease in his surroundings. This was Desmond Clark, though Victoria had no way of knowing that yet. At 47, Desmond had spent the last 2 decades building one of the most successful pharmaceutical corporations in North America. He traveled frequently for business, always first class, always with the quiet dignity of someone who had earned his position through intelligence, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. Victoria's brain struggled to process the scene. In her world, a world of exclusive country clubs, charity galas, and corporate boardrooms, men who looked like Desmond were typically the ones serving drinks, not the ones drinking them. The cognitive dissonance created a hot flush of indignation that crawled up her neck like a rash. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. The words carried across the cabin, causing several other passengers to look up from their phones and magazines. "I think there's been some kind of mistake." Desmond didn't look up immediately. He finished reading the paragraph he was on, carefully marked his place with a leather bookmark, and then slowly raised his eyes to meet hers. His expression was calm, almost serene, with the kind of unshakable composure that comes from years of handling difficult situations with grace. "Yes," he asked, his voice deep and measured. There was no deference in his tone, no automatic assumption that Victoria's interruption deserved immediate attention. The response caught Victoria off guard. She was accustomed to instant recognition, immediate apologies, hurried explanations. The man's casual acknowledgement felt like a challenge to her authority. "You're in my seat," Victoria stated, stepping closer and looming over him. She held up her boarding pass like a weapon, waving it inches from his face. 1A. "This is my seat. I fly this route every month, and I specifically reserved this seat 6 months ago." Around them, the cabin continued filling with passengers, but the interaction was beginning to draw attention. In seat 2, C. Elena Santos, a 32-year-old tech executive from Miami, glanced up from her phone where she had been live-streaming her travel experience for her company's social media accounts. Something about the tension in the air made her finger hover over the record button. In seat 3, A. James Mitchell, a 45-year-old investment banker who filmed business travel content for his professional blog, quietly adjusted his phone's camera angle. He had been planning to film a review of British Airways' first-class service, but this unexpected drama might make for more engaging content. Desmond looked at Victoria's boarding pass, then back at her face. He didn't move. He didn't scramble for his ticket. He didn't offer the kind of profuse apology Victoria was expecting. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, ma'am," Desmond said softly, his tone remaining perfectly level. "But it's not on my part. I am seated exactly where I was assigned." "Assigned?" Victoria let out a sharp, incredulous laugh that echoed off the cabin walls. "Assigned by whom? Some kind of diversity lottery." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire, acrid and unmistakable. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Elena Santos felt her jaw drop slightly, her finger instinctively pressing record on her phone's live stream. James Mitchell's camera captured the moment from a different angle, his business training recognizing this as a potential public relations disaster in real time. Near the galley, Sophie Williams, the senior flight attendant for the first-class cabin, felt her stomach clench. At 29, Sophie had been flying international routes for 6 years, and she had dealt with Victoria Pemberton Wells before. She knew the woman's history of complaints, her tendency to treat staff as personal servants, her barely concealed disdain for passengers she deemed beneath her status. But Sophie also knew something Victoria didn't. She had seen the passenger manifest. She had reviewed the upgrade requests. She knew exactly who was sitting in seat 1A, and she knew this confrontation was about to become a disaster of epic proportions. "Ms. Pemberton Wells," Sophie called out, approaching with the kind of diplomatic smile that flight attendants perfect through years of managing difficult passengers. "Is everything all right? Can I help resolve any seating confusion?" Victoria turned on her like a predator sensing weakness. "Sophie, thank goodness. This gentleman seems to be confused about his seat assignment. I have 1A. I always have 1A. Please escort him to his correct seat so we can get this flight moving." Sophie's mouth went dry. She glanced at Desmond, who was watching the interaction with the patient expression of someone who had experienced similar situations before and knew exactly how they would unfold. "Ma'am, I understand your confusion," Sophie began carefully, "but Mr. Clark is in the correct seat. There was an equipment change this morning and some seat assignments were updated. Your seat has been moved to 2A directly behind this one. It has all the same amenities, and I don't want 2A. Victoria's voice rose, cracking the polite murmur that typically characterized first-class cabins. "I want 1A. I paid for 1A. And I certainly didn't pay $5,000 to stare at this man's head for 7 hours. The racial undertone in her words was unmistakable now. Elena's live stream was capturing every word, and the viewer count was climbing rapidly. Comments began flooding in from people around the world who were watching this confrontation unfold in real time. James Mitchell found himself torn between his journalistic instincts and his basic human decency. This was clearly turning into something much bigger than a simple seating dispute, and every fiber of his professional being told him to keep recording. In the back of the first-class cabin, an elderly woman named Margaret Foster, a retired teacher traveling to visit her grandchildren, shook her head in disgust. She had lived through the civil rights era, had seen this kind of entitled racism before, and recognized it immediately for what it was. Desmond closed his book entirely now, removing his glasses and cleaning them with deliberate slowness. When he looked back up at Victoria, his eyes held a depth of experience that suggested this was not his first encounter with such behavior. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I suggest you take your assigned seat. We're delaying the flight, and I'm sure the other passengers would like to depart on time." Victoria's face turned a dangerous shade of red. "Don't you dare tell me what to do. Do you have any idea who I am? Sterling Pharmaceuticals ships more cargo with this airline in a month than you could afford in a lifetime. I can have you removed from this plane. I can have you banned from this airline entirely." The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud, dark and ominous. But instead of the intimidation Victoria expected to see in Desmond's eyes, she saw something else entirely, a mixture of disappointment and what almost looked like pity. "I'm sure you're very important," Desmond replied, his voice remaining steady and calm. "But right now you're just a passenger making a scene in an aircraft aisle." Victoria straightened up as if she had been slapped. The audacity of this man, this stranger, who had somehow stolen her seat, talking to her like an equal, was beyond her comprehension. In her world, deference was automatic. Apologies were immediate, and problems disappeared with the mere mention of her family name. Stewardess Victoria snapped her voice, carrying to every corner of the first-class cabin. "Get the captain, now!" Sophie Williams felt her professional smile falter. 6 years of flight experience had taught her to handle drunk passengers, medical emergencies, and even the occasional air rage incident. But this situation felt different, more volatile, more public, and infinitely more dangerous for everyone involved. "Ms. Pemberton Wells," Sophie said, her voice tight with barely controlled tension. "The captain is completing the pre-flight checklist. I'm sure we can resolve this seating issue without— I don't care if he's performing open-heart surgery." Victoria interrupted, her voice rising to a level that made passengers throughout the cabin look up from their phones, books, and conversations. "Get the captain here immediately, or I will call my lawyer and sue this airline for breach of contract before we even leave the tarmac." Elena Santos, still live-streaming from Seat 2. C whispered into her phone. "Y'all, this is getting intense. We've got a situation developing on Flight 847 to London, and it's about to get a lot worse." The viewer count on her stream had jumped to over 3,000 people, with comments flowing so fast they were barely readable. In Seat 3, a James Mitchell was struggling with the ethics of his situation. His business blog typically focused on travel reviews and corporate strategy, but this was clearly turning into something much more significant. He kept his phone recording, knowing that whatever was about to happen would likely have consequences far beyond this aircraft. Victoria turned back to Desmond, her eyes narrowing with the kind of calculating malice that comes from a lifetime of getting her way through intimidation. "I want to see your ticket. I want to see proof that you actually paid for this seat, because I guarantee you didn't." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several passengers gasped audibly. Margaret Foster, the retired teacher in the back, stood up slightly in her seat, her teacher instincts recognizing bullying behavior when she saw it. "Ma'am," Margaret called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 40 years managing unruly teenagers. "That's quite enough. The gentleman is clearly—" "Nobody asked you," Victoria snapped without even turning around. "This is between me and the man who's stolen my seat." Desmond looked up at Victoria with an expression that was becoming increasingly unreadable. He had faced discrimination before, subtle and overt, in boardrooms and restaurants, at hotels and airports, but rarely had he encountered someone quite so brazen in their assumptions, quite so confident in their ability to use their privilege as a weapon. "You want to see my ticket?" Desmond asked quietly. "Yes, I do. And I want to see your credit card statement proving you paid for it. And I want to see your ID so we can verify that you are who you claim to be." The demands were getting more outrageous by the minute, but Victoria was past caring about appearances. The stress of the failing merger, the pressure from her father, the mounting anxiety about Sterling Pharmaceutical's future. It was all crystallizing into this moment, this seat, this man who refused to acknowledge her superiority. Elena's live-stream chat was exploding with comments now. Viewers from around the world were weighing in, and the hashtag Flight 847 was beginning to trend on social media platforms. Someone had already created a TikTok compilation of the confrontation, and it was being shared at an exponential rate. Desmond reached into his jacket pocket with deliberate slowness. He pulled out a leather wallet, expensive, understated the kind carried by someone who didn't need to advertise their wealth, and extracted his boarding pass. "Here," he said, holding it up so Victoria could see. "Seat 1A, Desmond Clark." Victoria snatched the boarding pass from his hand, studying it with the intensity of a forensic investigator. The pass was legitimate, clearly printed by the airline's system with all the proper codes and markings. But instead of accepting the evidence in front of her, Victoria's paranoia deepened. "This could be fake," she announced loudly. "People print fake boarding passes all the time. Sophie, I want you to call security. I want this man's documentation verified by airport police." The cabin fell into a stunned silence. Even the most privileged passengers aboard Flight 847 recognized that Victoria had crossed a line from which there might be no return. This was no longer about a seating dispute. This was about something much darker and more dangerous. Sophie looked desperately toward the cockpit, hoping the captain might emerge and take control of the situation. But protocol required her to handle passenger disputes whenever possible, and she was quickly running out of diplomatic options. "Ma'am," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I cannot call security on a passenger who is legitimately seated and has done nothing wrong." Victoria's eyes flashed with fury. "Nothing wrong. He's stolen my seat. He's disrupting my flight. He's—" She was interrupted by the soft chime of Desmond's phone. He glanced at the screen and answered with a simple, "Clark here." The conversation that followed was brief, conducted in the kind of professional shorthand that suggested high-level business communications. Victoria found herself listening despite her anger, trying to parse the fragments of conversation she could overhear. "Yes, the London meeting is confirmed. No, reschedule the Brussels presentation for Thursday. Tell them we're proceeding with the acquisition regardless of the German regulatory delays." When Desmond ended the call, Victoria was staring at him with a mixture of confusion and growing unease. The phone call suggested a level of business authority that didn't match her assumptions about who belonged in first class and who didn't. "Businessman, are we?" Victoria said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let me guess. Middle management at some startup flying on the company dime." Desmond looked at her with an expression that might have been amusement if it weren't so sad. "Something like that," he said quietly. Elena's live stream had now attracted over 5,000 viewers, and the comments were becoming increasingly heated. People from around the world were watching this confrontation unfold in real time, and many were expressing outrage at Victoria's behavior. James Mitchell found his business training kicking in as he watched the interaction. Something about Desmond's composure, his expensive clothing, the professional nature of his phone call. It all suggested that Victoria might be making a catastrophic mistake in assumptions. Meanwhile, in economy class, Carmen Rodriguez was growing increasingly worried. She could hear raised voices from the first-class cabin, and while she couldn't make out specific words, she recognized the particular pitch and timbre of Victoria's anger. Carmen had seen her boss in full meltdown mode before, and she knew how these situations typically ended with apologies, payoffs, and NDAs designed to make problems disappear. But something about today felt different. Victoria's stress levels had been escalating for weeks, and Carmen had begun secretly documenting some of her boss's more problematic behavior. Not out of malice, but out of a growing sense that she might need to protect herself when Victoria's house of cards finally collapsed. Back in first class, Victoria was building toward her crescendo. She had played every card in her deck: intimidation, threats, appeals to authority, and nothing had worked. Desmond remained calmly seated, showing no signs of backing down or accepting her version of reality. Fine Victoria announced loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "If you won't move voluntarily, and if our flight attendant won't do her job, then I'll make this everyone's problem." She pulled out her phone and began dialing with theatrical precision. "I'm calling my family's aviation attorney. Sterling Pharmaceuticals has contracts worth hundreds of millions with this airline. By the time I'm done, You'll be lucky if you're allowed on a city bus, much less a transatlantic flight." The threat was delivered with the kind of cold calculation that Victoria had learned from years of boardroom warfare. In her experience, the mere mention of legal action and corporate contracts was usually enough to make problems disappear. Airlines, like most businesses, were terrified of wealthy customers with legal teams on retainer. But Desmond didn't flinch. He didn't reach for his luggage or start gathering his belongings. He simply looked at Victoria with the kind of patient expression that teachers reserve for particularly difficult students. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I think you're going to want to reconsider that phone call." Victoria paused, her finger hovering over her phone's screen. Something in Desmond's tone, not threatening, not angry, but absolutely certain, made her hesitate. "Is that a threat?" she asked. "No," Desmond replied. "It's advice, but you're welcome to ignore it." The cabin had become a pressure cooker of tension and anticipation. Every passenger was now watching. Many were recording and thousands more were following along via Elena's live stream. The hashtag Flight 847 was trending in multiple countries, and clips of the confrontation were being shared across every major social media platform. Victoria looked around the cabin, suddenly aware of all the eyes focused on her. Instead of feeling intimidated, she felt empowered. This was her moment to demonstrate her authority, to show everyone who belonged in first class and who didn't. "You know what," she announced to the cabin at large, "I think everyone here deserves to know exactly what kind of person thinks they can steal someone else's seat." Victoria turned to address the cabin like a prosecutor making her closing argument. Her voice carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms, but there was an edge to it now, a shrillness that suggested she was operating beyond the bounds of rational thought. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her arms spread wide in a gesture that encompassed the entire first-class section. "I want you all to witness what happens when airlines prioritize political correctness over paying customers." Elena's live stream viewer count had jumped to over 10,000, with comments flowing so rapidly that they created a digital waterfall of outrage, support, and disbelief. The hashtag Flight 847 was now trending in 6 countries, and major news outlets were beginning to pick up the story. "This is actually happening," Elena whispered into her phone, her voice filled with a mixture of fascination and horror. "We're watching someone's career end in real time." James Mitchell, still recording from seat 3, he found himself thinking about crisis management protocols he had studied in business school. Whatever company Victoria worked for was about to face a public relations nightmare of epic proportions, and every word she spoke was being preserved in digital amber for posterity. Desmond remained seated throughout Victoria's performance, his expression unchanged. He had closed his book entirely now, and was watching her with the kind of clinical interest that a scientist might show when observing a particularly volatile chemical reaction. "This man," Victoria continued, pointing dramatically at Desmond, "has somehow acquired my boarding pass, my seat assignment, my reservation. I have flown this exact route 53 times in the past 3 years. Seat 1, A, is mine. It has always been mine." Margaret Foster, the retired teacher, had heard enough. At 72, she had lived through the civil rights movement, had taught integrated classrooms in the South during the 1970s, and recognized racial prejudice when she heard it, no matter how it was disguised. "Young woman," Margaret called out, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who had spent 4 decades managing teenagers, "you need to sit down and stop embarrassing yourself." Victoria whirled around to face the elderly woman. "I beg your pardon. You heard me," Margaret replied, standing up to her full height of 5 feet and 2 inches. "I've been watching this display for 10 minutes now, and it's clear to everyone except you that this gentleman has done absolutely nothing wrong." Other passengers began to murmur their agreement. The tech CEO in seat 2F nodded approvingly. A businessman from Dallas quietly said, "She's right." Even some of the traditionally reserved British passengers were showing signs of support for Margaret's intervention. Victoria felt the cabin's sentiment shifting against her, but instead of backing down, she doubled down on her accusations. You don't understand the situation. This is about exactly what we all think it's about, interrupted a voice from the middle of the cabin. Dr. Michael Torres, a pediatric surgeon traveling to London for a medical conference, had been quietly watching the confrontation while trying to review case files. But Victoria's increasingly desperate rhetoric had finally pushed him to speak up. Dr. Torres is right, called out another passenger. We can all see what's happening here. Victoria found herself facing a cabin full of hostile witnesses, but her desperation made retreat impossible. The merger meeting in London was supposed to save Sterling Pharmaceuticals, and every minute of this delay was jeopardizing her carefully planned schedule. Fine, she announced, her voice taking on a dangerous edge. If none of you care about airline security, if none of you care about proper procedures, then I'll handle this myself. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, opening the camera app with deliberate precision. I'm going to document this theft for the authorities. I'm going to film this man's face so security can identify him when we land. The threat of being filmed seemed to galvanize the other passengers. Elena immediately turned her own camera toward Victoria, creating a bizarre standoff of competing recordings. If you're filming him, Elena announced loudly, then I'm filming you, and so is he and she is, and probably half the cabin by now. She was right. Nearly every passenger in first class now had their phones out, creating a digital panopticon that captured every word, every gesture, every nuance of the confrontation. The power dynamic that Victoria had tried to establish was collapsing in real time. James Mitchell, still maintaining his businessman's perspective, realized that they were witnessing something historically significant. This wasn't just a passenger dispute. This was a case study in how social media and digital connectivity had fundamentally changed the balance of power between individuals and institutions. Sophie Williams, the flight attendant, was beginning to panic. Her training had covered difficult passengers' medical emergencies and security threats, but nothing had prepared her for managing a viral social media incident at 35,000 feet. She could see the captain's door, but protocol required her to exhaust all other options before involving the flight crew in passenger disputes. Miss Pemberton Wells. Sophie said, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining professional composure. I really need you to take your assigned seat so we can complete our departure preparations. I am not sitting in 2A, Victoria declared with finality. I am not sitting behind this man for 7 hours. I am not accepting a downgrade because someone decided to play diversity games with seating assignments. The racial subtext of her comments was becoming increasingly explicit, and the cabin's reaction was growing more hostile by the minute. Passengers were no longer just watching, they were actively taking sides, and Victoria was losing badly. Desmond finally spoke, his voice cutting through the chaos with quiet authority. Ma'am, may I ask you a question? Victoria turned to face him, suspicious but curious. What? In all your flights on this route, in all your experiences with this airline, have you ever seen them arbitrarily reassign seats without cause? The question was simple, logical, and completely undermined Victoria's entire narrative. British Airways, like all major carriers, had strict protocols for seat assignments. Changes were typically made for safety reasons, equipment swaps, or passenger accommodation requests, never randomly, never capriciously. Victoria found herself momentarily speechless, which gave Desmond the opportunity to continue. I'm asking because you seem to believe that this airline would risk a lawsuit, bad publicity, and the loss of a valuable customer just to inconvenience you specifically. Does that seem reasonable to you? James Mitchell found himself nodding along with Desmond's logic. From a business perspective, Victoria's conspiracy theory made no sense whatsoever. Airlines were motivated by profit efficiency and risk management, not elaborate schemes to upset paying customers. But Victoria was too far down the rabbit hole of her own assumptions to accept rational explanations. You're very articulate for someone who... She caught herself before completing the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Everyone in the cabin understood what she had been about to say, and the reaction was immediate and visceral. "Oh, hell no," Elena said directly into her live stream. "Did she just—" "Yes, she did," confirmed Dr. Torres from the middle of the cabin. "We all heard it." Margaret Foster shook her head in disgust. "Child, you need to stop talking before you make this worse for yourself." But Victoria was beyond the reach of good advice. The stress of her failing business, the pressure from her father, the fear of losing everything she had worked for, it was all channeling into this moment, this seat, this man who refused to acknowledge her authority. "I want to see identification," Victoria demanded, her voice rising to near hysteria. "I want to see a passport. I want to see proof that he has the right to be in this country, much less in first class." The cabin fell into stunned silence. Even by the degraded standards of the confrontation so far, Victoria's demand represented a new low. Several passengers gasped audibly. Elena's live stream chat exploded with outrage. James Mitchell found his hands shaking as he held his phone steady. Desmond looked up at Victoria with an expression of profound sadness. Not anger, not indignation, not hurt, just the deep, weary sadness of someone who had hoped to get through another day without being reminded of humanity's capacity for cruelty. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I was born in Toronto. I'm a Canadian citizen with dual American citizenship. I've been traveling internationally for business for over 20 years. And I've never been asked to prove my right to exist in a space I've paid to occupy." His response was measured, dignified, and devastating in its calm precision. Victoria had played her last card, the citizenship card, and it had been turned against her with surgical precision. Carmen Rodriguez, listening from economy class, felt her stomach clench with recognition and shame. She had heard Victoria make similar comments in private, had watched her boss's casual racism emerge in moments of stress, but had never seen it displayed so publicly or so devastatingly. Carmen pulled out her own phone and began typing a resignation letter. Whatever happened next, she knew she could no longer work for someone who would behave this way in public. The live stream had probably captured her face in the background, and her association with Victoria was about to become a professional liability. Back in first class, Sophie Williams had reached her breaking point. 6 years of customer service experience told her that this situation was spiraling beyond her ability to manage, and she needed help from someone with more authority. "I'm going to get the captain," she announced to the cabin at large. "Everyone, please remain in your seats." Victoria seized on the announcement like a lifeline. Finally, "Yes, get the captain. Get security. Get whoever you need to remove this man from my seat." But Sophie's expression suggested that the captain's intervention might not produce the results Victoria was expecting. As the flight attendant disappeared into the cockpit, the cabin fell into an expectant silence that felt like the calm before a storm. Elena continued live streaming her viewer count, now approaching 15,000. The hashtag Flight 847 was trending worldwide, and clips of Victoria's meltdown were being shared across every major platform. News outlets were beginning to pick up the story, and social media analysts were already predicting that this would become one of the year's most viral incidents. James Mitchell, reviewing the footage he had captured, realized that he had documented something that would likely be studied in business schools for years to come. This wasn't just about airline seating, it was about privilege assumptions, social media, and the increasingly fragile boundary between private behavior and public accountability. Desmond sat quietly throughout the chaos, occasionally glancing at his watch, but otherwise maintaining the same calm composure he had shown since the confrontation began. He seemed to be waiting for something, not with anxiety or impatience, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly how this story would end. The cabin door opened, and Captain Robert Hayes, no relation to Desmond, though the coincidence would later fuel numerous conspiracy theories, emerged from the cockpit. A 20-year veteran of international aviation, Captain Hayes had seen every kind of passenger disturbance imaginable, but the scene in his first-class cabin was unlike anything in his experience. "Good morning, passengers," Captain Hayes announced, his voice carrying the calm authority that comes from years of managing complex situations. "I understand we have a seating issue to resolve." Victoria immediately seized the initiative. "Captain, thank goodness. This man has stolen my seat, refused to move despite multiple requests, and is now disrupting the entire flight. I need him removed immediately so we can depart on schedule." Captain Hayes nodded thoughtfully, his expression neutral and professional. He looked at Desmond, who remained seated and silent, then back at Victoria, who was vibrating with barely contained energy. "And you are?" "Captain Hayes?" asked Victoria. "Victoria Pemberton Wells, Executive Vice President of Sterling Pharmaceuticals. I fly this route regularly, always in Seat 1A, and I have important business in London that cannot be delayed." Captain Hayes made a note on his clipboard. "And you, sir?" For the first time since the confrontation began, Desmond stood up. He straightened to his full height, adjusted his glasses, and extended his hand to Captain Hayes with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested long familiarity with such introductions. "Desmond Clark," he said simply. Captain Hayes shook his hand, and something passed between the two men, a look of recognition, mutual respect, and what might have been amusement. The exchange was subtle, almost imperceptible, but several passengers noticed it. Elena whispered into her live stream, "Y'all, something just changed. The captain knows who this man is." Captain Hayes maintained his professional demeanor, but passengers who were paying close attention noticed subtle changes in his posture and tone when addressing Desmond. There was a deference there, a level of respect that went beyond simple courtesy between strangers. "Mr. Clark," Captain Hayes said, consulting his clipboard, "I believe you're in the correct seat, according to our manifest." Victoria's face went through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous crimson. "That's impossible. I reserved this seat 6 months ago. I have confirmation emails. I have receipt records." "Ma'am, I understand your frustration," Captain Hayes replied, "but passenger seat assignments are managed by our booking system, and that system shows Mr. Clark as the assigned occupant of 1A. Elena's live stream chat was moving so fast that individual comments were impossible to read, but the general sentiment was clear. Something significant was about to happen. The viewer count had climbed past 20,000, and hashtag Flight847 was now the top trending hashtag in multiple countries. "I want to see the manifest," Victoria demanded. "I want to see the booking records. I want documentation proving that this man legitimately purchased this seat." Captain Hayes exchanged another glance with Desmond, and this time the look was unmistakably conspiratorial. "Ma'am, passenger booking information is confidential. I can't share those details with other passengers." "Other passengers?" Victoria's voice hit a pitch that made several people wince. "I'm not other passengers. I'm Sterling Pharmaceuticals. We have corporate contracts with this airline worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually." Desmond's phone buzzed softly, and he glanced at the screen. "Excuse me," he said to Captain Hayes. "I need to take this call." He answered with a simple, "Clark here," but this time he didn't lower his voice or step away for privacy. The conversation that followed was conducted at normal volume in full hearing of the entire first-class cabin. "Yes, the Brussels presentation is confirmed for Thursday. No, tell them we're proceeding with the Hoffman acquisition regardless of the German regulatory delays. The FDA approval should come through by month end, which puts us ahead of schedule for the Q4 launch." Victoria found herself listening despite her anger. The conversation suggested not just business authority, but significant business authority. Terms like acquisition, FDA approval, and regulatory delays indicated someone operating at a very high level in the pharmaceutical industry. James Mitchell, still recording, felt his business journalist instincts kicking into high gear. The fragments of conversation he was capturing suggested that Desmond might be much more than the middle management executive Victoria had assumed him to be. When Desmond ended the call, Victoria was staring at him with a mixture of confusion and growing concern. "What company did you say you work for?" "I didn't," Desmond replied calmly. Captain Hayes checked his watch. "Mr. Clark, we're running a bit behind schedule. Would you prefer to continue this discussion, or shall we proceed with departure?" The question was clearly directed at Desmond, not Victoria, and the implicit deference was becoming impossible to ignore. Victoria looked back and forth between the captain and Desmond, trying to understand the dynamic she was witnessing. "Why are you asking him?" Victoria demanded. "I'm the one with the seating issue. I'm the one who's been inconvenienced." "Ma'am," Captain Hayes said with strained patience, "you've been offered an alternate seat with identical amenities. Mr. Clark is in his assigned seat and has done nothing wrong." Elena whispered into her live stream. "The captain is definitely treating them differently. Something is happening here that we're not seeing yet." Margaret Foster, the retired teacher, was watching the interaction with the shrewd eyes of someone who had spent 40 years reading social dynamics. "That young man," she said to her seatmate, "is not just any businessman." Dr. Torres, still trying to review his medical files, found himself distracted by the increasingly obvious signs that Victoria had made a catastrophic error in judgment. The captain's deference, Desmond's high-level business calls, his expensive clothing and confident demeanor. It all pointed to someone with significant authority and influence. Victoria's desperation was becoming palpable. The merger meeting in London was crucial to Sterling Pharmaceutical's survival, and every minute of delay was jeopardizing her carefully orchestrated schedule. But more than that, she was beginning to sense that she had stumbled into something much more dangerous than a simple seating dispute. "I want to speak to your supervisor," Victoria told Captain Hayes. "I want to speak to whoever is in charge of this airline's customer relations." "Ma'am, I am the captain of this aircraft. During flight operations, I am the highest authority available." Desmond's phone buzzed again, this time with a text message. He glanced at the screen and smiled slightly, the first genuine expression of pleasure he had shown since the confrontation began. "Good news?" Captain Hayes asked. Captain Hayes. "The London meetings are confirmed," Desmond replied. "All parties will be present as scheduled." Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. She was traveling to London for meetings as well, specifically a merger discussion with Meridian Pharmaceutical Corporation. The coincidence seemed impossible, but something about Desmond's tone suggested it might not be a coincidence at all. "What meetings?" Victoria asked, her voice smaller now, less certain. Desmond looked at her with an expression that might have been sympathy. "Business meetings, Ms. Pemberton Wells. The kind that determine the future of companies and industries." The use of her name was like a physical blow. Victoria realized that Desmond had known who she was all along, had heard her introduce herself to the captain, had probably understood the implications of her behavior from the very beginning. "How do you know about Sterling Pharmaceuticals?" Victoria asked, though she was beginning to suspect she didn't want to hear the answer. "It's a small industry," Desmond replied. "Everyone knows everyone, especially when major mergers are being discussed." Elena's live stream viewers were now approaching 30,000, and major news outlets were beginning to pick up the story. CNN, BBC, and Reuters had all published preliminary reports about a viral airline confrontation involving racial profiling and corporate executives. Carmen Rodriguez, watching from economy class, felt her stomach drop. She had helped arrange Victoria's London meetings, had coordinated with Meridian Pharmaceutical's scheduling team, and was beginning to understand the full magnitude of what was happening. She pulled out her phone and began typing an urgent text to her cousin, who worked in pharmaceutical industry public relations. "Turn on the news. Victoria is having a breakdown on a plane and it's going viral. I think she just destroyed the Meridian deal." Back in first class, James Mitchell was beginning to piece together the larger story. His business journalism background had taught him to recognize the signs of major corporate news, and everything about this situation suggested they were witnessing something that would have significant industry implications. "Excuse me," James said, addressing Desmond directly. "I'm James Mitchell, business journalist. Would you be willing to comment on what's happening here?" Victoria immediately turned on him. "Don't interview him. This man is nobody. He's stolen my seat, and he's trying to make himself sound important." But Desmond was already shaking hands with James, and the handshake had the quality of equals meeting rather than strangers being introduced. "Mr. Mitchell," Desmond said, "I'd prefer to let events speak for themselves." "What events?" Victoria demanded. "What are you talking about?" Captain Hayes consulted his clipboard one more time. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the cabin, "I apologize for the delay. We'll be departing momentarily, but first I have a brief announcement to make." The cabin fell silent. Elena adjusted her phone's angle to capture whatever was about to happen. James Mitchell checked his recording levels. Margaret Foster leaned forward in her seat. Even the passengers in economy class were straining to hear what the captain was about to say. Victoria stood frozen in the aisle, suddenly aware that she was at the center of something much larger than a seating dispute. Her business instincts, honed by years of corporate warfare, were screaming warnings at her, but it was too late to retreat. "Before we begin our flight to London," Captain Hayes continued, his voice carrying clearly throughout the aircraft, "I want to personally welcome one of our passengers aboard." Victoria felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. She looked at Desmond, who was watching her with an expression of infinite patience, and suddenly understood that she had been playing a game without knowing the rules. The next words from Captain Hayes would change everything: her business, her reputation, her future, and the future of Sterling Pharmaceuticals. In the seconds before he spoke, Victoria had one last moment of clarity, one final opportunity to understand how catastrophically wrong she had been about the man sitting quietly in seat 1A. But understanding came too late. The words were already forming in Captain Hayes's mouth, and 30,000 people were watching via livestream as Victoria Pemberton Wells's world began to collapse. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Hayes said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and formality that comes with years of military precision and commercial aviation protocol. "I want to personally welcome aboard Mr. Desmond Clark, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Pharmaceutical Corporation." The words hit the cabin like a shockwave. The silence that followed was so complete that the only sounds were the gentle hum of the aircraft's systems and the barely audible intake of breath from 30 passengers who suddenly understood they had witnessed something unprecedented. Victoria Pemberton Wells felt the blood drain from her face so rapidly that she actually swayed on her feet. The merger meeting she was traveling to attend, the meeting that was supposed to save Sterling Pharmaceuticals, secure her position, and justify her father's confidence in her leadership, was with Meridian Pharmaceutical Corporation. The man she had spent 20 minutes humiliating, threatening, and racially profiling was the CEO of the company she desperately needed to partner with. Elena's live stream exploded. The viewer count jumped from 30,000 to 50,000 in less than 30 seconds. The chat moved so fast it became an incomprehensible blur of shock, outrage, and disbelief. Hashtag Flight 847 wasn't just trending, it was dominating global social media platforms. James Mitchell, still recording, felt his journalistic instincts override his shock. This wasn't just a viral moment. This was a legitimate news story with massive business implications. He was documenting the real-time destruction of a corporate executive's career and possibly an entire company's future. Margaret Foster, the retired teacher, shook her head slowly and muttered to her seatmate, "That young woman just learned the most expensive lesson of her life." Dr. Torres closed his medical files entirely, recognizing that he was witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. This was a case study in assumptions, privilege, and the devastating consequences of both. Victoria tried to speak, but no words came out. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, her brain struggling to process the magnitude of her mistake. 20 minutes ago, she had been an executive vice president traveling to secure a crucial merger. Now, she was a viral sensation who had just destroyed her company's most important partnership while being watched by tens of thousands of people worldwide. Desmond Clark, CEO. Desmond Clark, she now understood, remained seated and calm throughout the announcement. He nodded politely to Captain Hayes and offered a small wave to the passengers who had begun applauding, though the applause felt more like the appreciation offered to someone who had demonstrated remarkable restraint under impossible circumstances. Mr. Clark, Captain Hayes continued, thank you for your patience with our departure delay. I hope the remainder of your flight to London is comfortable. Thank you, Captain Desmond replied with the kind of gracious professionalism that comes from years of public appearances and media attention. I'm sure it will be. Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. You're the CEO of Meridian. Desmond turned to look at her, and for the first time since the confrontation began, his expression showed something other than infinite patience. There was disappointment there, and sadness, and what might have been pity. Yes, Miss Pemberton Wells, I am. The use of her name, spoken with full knowledge of who she was and why she was traveling to London, drove home the reality of her situation with devastating clarity. He had known all along. He had known who she was, where she was going, and why she needed this meeting to go well. The merger, Victoria stammered. Our meeting tomorrow will not be taking place, Desmond finished quietly. Elena's live stream chat exploded with variations of, oh no, she didn't, and this is insane, and she just destroyed her whole company. The viewer count was approaching 75,000, and major news organizations were now running live updates about the incident. Carmen Rodriguez, watching from economy class, felt physically ill. She had spent months coordinating the Meridian meeting, had worked 18-hour days, preparing presentations and documents, had arranged every detail of Victoria's travel itinerary. All of that work, all of Sterling Pharmaceutical's hopes for survival, had just been destroyed by 20 minutes of spectacular stupidity. She pulled out her phone and began typing her resignation letter, knowing that association with Victoria was about to become toxic throughout the pharmaceutical industry. James Mitchell, still recording, realized he needed to act like a journalist rather than a passenger. Mr. Clark, he said respectfully, would you be willing to provide a statement about what just occurred? Desmond considered the question thoughtfully. What occurred here today was a demonstration of assumptions. Assumptions about who belongs in certain spaces, who deserves respect, and who has the right to make demands of others based on their appearance or background. His words were measured, professional, and devastating in their implications. This wasn't just a statement about the airline incident. This was a corporate leader making an official response to racial discrimination that had been witnessed by tens of thousands of people. Victoria tried desperately to salvage something from the wreckage of her behavior. Mr. Clark, please. I made a mistake. I was stressed about the meeting under pressure from my father, worried about the company. Surely we can discuss this privately, work out our differences. Miss Pemberton Wells. Desmond replied, his voice gentle but firm. 20 minutes ago, you demanded to see my identification to prove I had the right to be in this country. You suggested I had stolen my seat, forged my boarding pass, and didn't belong in first class. You made those statements in front of dozens of witnesses while being recorded by multiple cameras. Victoria's desperation was palpable now. I know how it looked, but I didn't mean. I wasn't trying to. It wasn't about race. It was about the seat, about my stress level, It was about exactly what everyone thinks it was about, interrupted Dr. Torres from the middle of the cabin, echoing Margaret Foster's earlier words. And now, everyone knows who you really are. The doctor was right. Victoria's behavior had revealed something essential about her character, and that revelation had been broadcast to a global audience. There was no walking it back, no explaining it away, no containing the damage. Sophie Williams, the flight attendant who had tried so desperately to manage the situation, approached Victoria with an expression of professional sympathy mixed with relief. "Ma'am, I really need you to take your seat now so we can complete our departure." Victoria looked around the cabin one more time. Every face was turned toward her, but the expressions were no longer curious or entertained. They were disgusted, disappointed, and in some cases angry. She had become the villain in a story that was being shared with millions of people. "My seat," Victoria said weakly. 2A. "Yes, ma'am." Directly behind Mr. Clark. The irony was unavoidable and cruel. For the next 7 hours, Victoria would be forced to sit directly behind the man she had tried to humiliate, staring at the back of his head, while contemplating the destruction of her career and her company's future. As she slumped into seat, 2A Victoria could hear the soft chime of notifications from phones throughout the cabin. Passengers were sharing clips, posting updates, and sending messages about what they had witnessed. The story was spreading exponentially, moving from social media to news outlets to corporate communications. Elena, still live streaming, provided commentary for her now massive audience. "Y'all, we just watched someone end their entire career in 20 minutes. This is going to be studied in business schools for decades." She was right. The incident would indeed become a case study in crisis management corporate behavior and the power of social media to instantly amplify and punish bad behavior. But for Victoria, those academic implications were less important than the immediate reality Sterling Pharmaceuticals was finished. Desmond settled back into his seat 1A, which had been his all along, and reopened his book. The calm composure he had maintained throughout the confrontation seemed genuine rather than performative. He had handled the situation with remarkable grace, never losing his temper, never stooping to Victoria's level, never abandoning his dignity even in the face of sustained attack. As the aircraft finally began its taxi toward the runway, Captain Hayes made one final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We're now cleared for takeoff to London Heathrow. Flight attendants prepare for departure." The routine words carried extra weight after what had just occurred. This flight would be remembered not for its destination or its duration, but for 20 minutes of confrontation that had exposed fundamental truths about privilege, racism, and the consequences of both in an interconnected world. Victoria stared at the seatback in front of her Desmond seatback and began to understand the full magnitude of what she had done. The merger was dead. Her career was over. Sterling Pharmaceuticals would likely collapse within months. Her father would never forgive her. And all of it had been captured in high-definition video and broadcast to a global audience. The plane lifted off from JFK carrying Victoria toward London and the meeting that would never happen. While below them, the story of Flight 847 continued to spread across the internet at the speed of light. As Flight 847 reached cruising altitude, Victoria's phone began buzzing with the relentless persistence of a smoke alarm. Text messages, missed calls, voicemails, and email notifications flooded her device in an avalanche of corporate panic and personal disappointment. The first call was from her father, Richard Pemberton, founder and chairman of Sterling Pharmaceuticals. Victoria stared at his name on the screen for 3 full rings before finally answering. "Dad," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Victoria." Richard's voice carried the kind of cold fury that comes from 40 years of building a company and watching it destroyed in 20 minutes of social media footage. "I'm looking at a video of you accusing Desmond Clark of stealing an airline seat. Please tell me this is some kind of elaborate joke." Victoria closed her eyes, knowing that the conversation was about to get much worse. "Dad, I can explain. Explain how you racially profiled the CEO of the company we've been courting for 6 months. Explain how you destroyed a $50 million merger while being filmed by half the internet." Other passengers in first class were pretending not to listen, but in the confined space of an aircraft cabin, privacy was impossible. Victoria could feel their attention like heat from a fire. "I didn't know who he was," Victoria said weakly. "He was in my seat and I was stressed about the meeting and your seat." Richard's voice rose enough to be heard several rows away. "Victoria, we are a pharmaceutical company, hanging on by our fingernails. We haven't had a successful drug approval in 3 years. Our stock is down 60%. This merger with Meridian was our lifeline and you just cut the rope." Elena, still live streaming to an audience that had grown to over 100,000 viewers, whispered into her phone. "Y'all, she's getting destroyed by her own father right now. This is brutal." Victoria tried to lower her voice, but the emotion made whisper impossible. "Can't we salvage something? Can't we explain that it was a misunderstanding?" "A misunderstanding?" Richard's bitter laugh carried clearly throughout the cabin. "Victoria, you're trending on Twitter. CNN is running the story. The BBC has picked it up. Sterling Pharmaceuticals executive racially profiles merger partner is a headline that's being read by millions of people right now." James Mitchell, still documenting the aftermath, recognized this as the moment when private family business became public corporate disaster. The phone conversation was providing real-time insight into how quickly modern scandals could destroy established companies. Victoria looked around the cabin, desperately seeking some escape from the reality of her situation. But every face she encountered reflected the same mixture of disgust and fascination. She had become a cautionary tale in real time. "The board is meeting in emergency session," Richard continued, his voice getting colder with each word. "They're discussing damage control liability issues and your immediate removal from all executive positions." "You can't fire me," Victoria said, though she knew it was futile. "I'm family. You were family when you represented the company with dignity. Right now, you're a liability we can't afford." The line went dead. Victoria stared at her phone, watching as more notifications poured in. Text messages from colleagues, voicemails from reporters, emails from business contacts, all trying to understand what they had witnessed online. She scrolled through her social media feeds with morbid fascination. The hashtag Flight 847 was accompanied by hashtag Sterling Pharmaceuticals and hashtag Victoria Pemberton. Her LinkedIn profile was being flooded with comments. Her professional reputation, built over 15 years of corporate climbing, was being destroyed in real time. 2 rows ahead, Desmond Clark was having a very different kind of phone conversation. His voice was low but audible, and the tone was one of measured professionalism rather than panic. "Yes, I understand the media attention. No, I don't think a lengthy statement is necessary. The incident speaks for itself. We'll proceed with the London schedule as planned, minus the Sterling meeting." Victoria listened to fragments of Desmond's conversation and realized that he was managing a crisis too, but his crisis was an opportunity. The viral video had made him a sympathetic figure, a dignified executive who had handled racial discrimination with remarkable grace. His company's stock was probably rising while hers collapsed. Carmen Rodriguez, watching from economy class, had spent the flight writing and rewriting her resignation letter. She finally settled on something direct and professional. "Dear Ms. Pemberton Wells, due to recent events and their reflection on Sterling Pharmaceuticals' corporate culture, I am resigning my position effective immediately. I will not be returning to work following this trip." She hit send and immediately felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Whatever happened next, she would not be associated with Victoria's toxic behavior any longer. Margaret Foster, the retired teacher, had been watching Victoria's distress with the kind of educational eye that comes from decades of observing young people face the consequences of their choices. She leaned across the aisle and spoke in the gentle but firm tone she had used with thousands of students. "Young woman Margaret said you're having what my students used to call a teachable moment. The question is whether you're going to learn from it." Victoria looked at Margaret through tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Learn what? How to destroy everything I've worked for in 20 minutes? Learn that other people aren't props in your story, Margaret replied. Learn that respect isn't something you can buy with frequent flyer miles. Learn that dignity is more important than getting your way. The conversation was overheard by several passengers, including Elena, who included Margaret's words in her ongoing live stream commentary. The elderly teacher's wisdom was being shared with hundreds of thousands of viewers as a counterpoint to Victoria's meltdown. Dr. Torres, who had been trying to review medical files for hours, finally closed his laptop and turned to address Victoria directly. I've been watching this situation unfold, and I think there's something you need to understand about the medical implications of stress-induced decision-making. Victoria looked at him with confusion, mixed with desperate hope. Maybe a medical perspective could provide some explanation, some mitigation for her behavior. When people are under extreme stress, Dr. Torres continued, they often revert to their core beliefs and assumptions. Pressure doesn't create character, it reveals it. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. There was no medical excuse for her behavior, no stress-related justification that would make her actions acceptable. She had revealed who she really was, and the world had seen it clearly. James Mitchell, who had been quietly documenting everything, decided to try one more interview attempt. Ms. Pemberton Wells, he said respectfully, would you like to make a statement about what happened today? Victoria looked at the camera on his phone and realized that anything she said would be preserved forever, analyzed by critics and used as evidence of her character. The smart move would be to say nothing to let her lawyers handle any public statements. But the silence felt like cowardice, and she had already lost everything that mattered. I made assumptions, she said, finally, her voice cracking. I made assumptions based on appearance, and those assumptions were wrong. I behaved in a way that doesn't represent who I want to be, and I'm going to have to live with the consequences. It wasn't much of an apology, and it came far too late to matter, but it was the first honest thing Victoria had said since boarding the aircraft. James nodded and stopped recording, recognizing that he had captured something genuine in the midst of manufactured drama. Sophie Williams, the flight attendant, approached Victoria's seat with a mixture of professional courtesy and personal sympathy. Ma'am, can I get you anything water tea? Victoria looked up at Sophie and saw something unexpected in the young woman's eyes. Forgiveness. Not approval of her behavior. Not acceptance of her excuses. But simple human compassion for someone experiencing the worst day of their life. Just water, please, Victoria said quietly. And Sophie, I'm sorry you had to deal with that. You were trying to do your job, and I made it impossible. Sophie nodded. Thank you for saying that. It means something. As the flight continued toward London, Victoria sat in seat 2A directly behind the man she had tried to humiliate and contemplated the wreckage of her life. Her phone continued buzzing with calls and messages, but she had stopped answering. There would be time for damage control later, though she suspected there was no controlling this particular damage. The story of Flight 847 was already being told and retold across social media platforms, news websites, and corporate communications. By the time they landed in London, Victoria Pemberton Wells would be one of the most infamous executives in recent memory, and Sterling Pharmaceuticals would be facing an existential crisis. But for now, she sat quietly in her assigned seat, learning the hardest lesson of her life, that actions have consequences, that privilege has limits, and that the internet never forgets. As Flight 847 crossed the Atlantic, the business world was processing the implications of what had become known as the Seatgate scandal. In corporate boardrooms from New York to London, executives were watching the viral footage and calculating the broader impact on industry's stock prices and merger strategies. Sterling Pharmaceutical's board of directors had convened an emergency meeting within 2 hours of the video going viral. Richard Pemberton sat at the head of the conference table in their Manhattan headquarters, staring at a laptop screen that showed his daughter's meltdown being replayed for the millionth time. The stock is down 47% and falling, reported CFO Margaret Chen, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. Trading volume is 10 times normal levels. Investors are fleeing like the building is on fire. Because it is on fire, replied General Counsel David Rodriguez. We're facing potential discrimination lawsuits, SEC investigations into our corporate culture, and the complete collapse of our most important strategic partnership. Richard closed the laptop with enough force to make everyone in the room flinch. 43 years. I spent 43 years building this company, and my daughter destroyed it in 20 minutes of airplane footage. The room fell silent except for the constant buzz of phones receiving updates about the scandal's expanding reach. Social media analytics firms were already predicting that the Flight 847 video would become one of the most shared corporate scandal clips in Internet history. Can we salvage the Meridian partnership? Asked Head of Business Development, Sarah Kim. Maybe if we fire Victoria, immediately issue a comprehensive apology, implement diversity training. I spoke to Desmond Clark 30 minutes ago. Richard interrupted. He was polite, professional, and absolutely final. Meridian Pharmaceutical Corporation will not be doing business with Sterling Pharmaceuticals under any circumstances. The financial implications were staggering. The Meridian merger had been valued at over $200 million and represented Sterling's primary strategy for surviving their recent string of FDA rejections. Without it, the company faced bankruptcy within 18 months. What about other potential partners? Margaret Chen asked desperately. Surely someone in the industry will want to associate with a company whose executive vice president racially profiled a CEO on a viral video. David Rodriguez shook his head. Margaret, we're toxic. Every pharmaceutical company in North America has seen that footage. Victoria didn't just attack Desmond Clark, she attacked the industry's most respected leader while representing our brand. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in London, Meridian Pharmaceutical's leadership team was having a very different kind of meeting. CEO Desmond Clark was participating via video call from the aircraft's Wi-Fi system, his calm demeanor unchanged despite the global attention. How are you handling this? Desmond asked COO Patricia Williams from Meridian's London headquarters. The media requests are overwhelming our communications team. Keep the statements brief and professional. Desmond replied, his image pixelating slightly due to the aircraft's internet connection. This isn't about Meridian, it's about industry standards and basic human dignity. We don't need to pile on to make our point. Chief Strategy Officer Michael Torres. Dr. Torres's younger brother, coincidentally, was reviewing social media analytics on his tablet. The public response has been overwhelmingly supportive. Our stock is up 12% since the video went viral. Investors see this as validation of your leadership and our corporate culture. Desmond nodded thoughtfully. Public relations benefits aside, this incident represents an opportunity to address broader issues in our industry. I want to establish a diversity and inclusion initiative that extends beyond our own company. The contrast between the two companies' responses was striking. While Sterling Pharmaceuticals was imploding under the weight of scandal, Meridian was using the incident as a catalyst for positive change and industry leadership. Victoria's phone had been buzzing constantly throughout the flight, but the nature of the calls was evolving from panic to cold calculation. Business contacts were distancing themselves, conference invitations were being rescinded, and professional associations were quietly removing her from leadership positions. Her assistant, Carmen Rodriguez, had already submitted her resignation, along with a detailed documentation of Victoria's pattern of discriminatory behavior. The document, prepared with the help of a labor attorney, would likely become evidence in future legal proceedings. Ms. Pemberton Wells. Sophie Williams approached Victoria's seat with professional courtesy that couldn't quite hide her personal distaste. You have several urgent calls holding. Would you like to use the aircraft phone system? Victoria looked at the list of missed calls on her phone screen. Reporters, lawyers, board members, and crisis management consultants all wanted to speak with her. None of the conversations would be pleasant. No, thank you. Victoria replied quietly. I think I'll wait until we land. Elena Santos, still live streaming to an audience that had grown to over 150,000 viewers, was providing real-time business analysis of the unfolding corporate disaster. Y'all, this is bigger than just one racist passenger. We're watching an entire company collapse because their executive couldn't control herself for 20 minutes. James Mitchell had been researching both companies during the flight using the aircraft's Wi-Fi to pull financial reports and industry analysis. His business journalist background allowed him to understand the broader implications of what they had witnessed. This is going to change how companies handle executive behavior, James commented to Dr. Torres, who was sitting across the aisle. Social media has made it impossible for corporations to contain scandals or control narratives. Dr. Torres nodded agreement. 20 years ago, this might have been handled quietly with apologies and settlements. Today, everything is public, permanent, and permanent. Margaret Foster, the retired teacher, had been listening to conversations throughout the cabin and offered her own perspective. In my 40 years of teaching, I learned that consequences are the only things that change behavior. This young woman needed to learn that actions matter, and unfortunately for her, she's learning it on a global stage. Desmond Clark, still seated calmly in 1A, was reviewing documents on his tablet when his phone rang with an international number. He answered with his usual professional greeting. Mr. Clark. This is Rebecca Chen from the Financial Times, came the voice through the aircraft phone system. We're preparing a story about today's incident and its impact on the pharmaceutical industry. Would you be available for comment? I'm willing to provide a brief statement. Desmond replied, his voice carrying clearly through the first-class cabin. But I'd prefer to focus on the broader issues rather than the individual incident. Victoria, listening from the seat directly behind him, felt a mixture of shame and admiration. Even after being publicly humiliated and racially profiled, Desmond was handling the situation with remarkable grace and strategic thinking. The reporter continued. Can you comment on the business impact? Sterling Pharmaceutical's stock has collapsed, and there are reports of potential bankruptcy. I can't comment on another company's financial situation, Desmond replied diplomatically. What I can say is that this incident demonstrates the importance of corporate leadership that reflects the values we claim to hold. Character matters in business, especially when someone thinks no one is watching. The statement was measured professional and devastatingly effective. Without directly attacking Victoria or Sterling Pharmaceuticals, Desmond had managed to articulate why the incident mattered and why consequences were appropriate. As the aircraft began its descent toward London, Heathrow, Victoria realized that she was traveling toward meetings that would never happen, partnerships that would never form, and a future that no longer existed. The merger presentation she had spent months preparing was obsolete. The career she had spent 15 years building was finished. The business consequences of 20 minutes of airline confrontation would ripple through the pharmaceutical industry for years to come. Sterling Pharmaceuticals would likely be acquired by competitors at fire sale prices. Hundreds of employees would lose their jobs. Investors would lose millions of dollars. And it all traced back to one moment of entitled rage, captured in high definition and broadcast to a global audience that would never forget what they had seen. As Flight 847 began its final approach to London Heathrow, Desmond Clark was already implementing changes that would extend far beyond the confines of the aircraft cabin. His phone conversations during the flight had set in motion a series of industry-wide initiatives that would transform how pharmaceutical companies approached diversity inclusion and executive accountability. Patricia Desmond said into his phone, speaking with Meridian's COO, I want you to establish the Clark Institute for Business Ethics by the end of the quarter. Partner with 3 major universities to create case studies on corporate behavior and social media accountability. Victoria, listening from seat 2. I felt each word like a physical blow. Desmond was using her failure as the foundation for institutional change, transforming her humiliation into educational opportunities that would benefit future business leaders. The Institute will offer scholarships for underrepresented students in pharmaceutical sciences. Desmond continued. And I want to create a reporting system for discrimination incidents across the industry. Companies that participate will receive preferred partnership status with Meridian. Elena Santos, still live streaming to an audience of nearly 200,000 viewers, was providing real-time commentary on what she recognized as historic business leadership. Y'all, we're not just watching someone recover from discrimination, we're watching them transform an entire industry because of it. James Mitchell, documenting the conversation for his business journalism, recognized that Desmond's response would likely become a case study in crisis leadership and strategic thinking. Instead of simply accepting apologies or seeking revenge, Desmond was leveraging the incident to create lasting institutional change. Margaret Foster, the retired teacher, nodded approvingly as she listened to Desmond's plans. Now that's how you turn a negative into a positive, she said to her seatmate. That young man understands that real change comes from creating better opportunities, not just punishing bad behavior. Sophie Williams, the senior flight attendant, approached Desmond's seat as the aircraft prepared for landing. Mr. Clark, I want to apologize for not intervening more decisively when the situation began. I should have recognized what was happening and stopped it sooner. Desmond looked up at Sophie with genuine warmth. Sophie, you handled an impossible situation with professionalism and grace. You tried to de-escalate while maintaining respect for all passengers. That's exactly what good leadership looks like. Thank you, sir. That means a lot coming from you. Actually, Desmond continued, I'd like to offer you a position with Meridian. We're expanding our corporate travel and executive services division, and we need someone with your skills and judgment. Sophie's eyes widened with surprise and gratitude. Sir, I don't know what to say. Say you'll consider it. Corporate culture changes one person at a time, and we need people who understand that dignity isn't negotiable. Victoria watched this exchange with growing understanding of how completely she had misjudged the situation. Desmond wasn't just a successful CEO, he was the kind of leader who lifted others up, who created opportunities rather than simply demanding deference. Dr. Torres, who had been quietly observing throughout the flight, approached Victoria's seat as passengers began preparing for landing. Ms. Pemberton Wells, may I offer some perspective as someone who's seen a lot of people at their worst moments? Victoria looked up at him with the hollow eyes of someone who had lost everything in a single day. What's the point? It's over. Everything is over. The point, Dr. Torres replied gently, is that this doesn't have to define the rest of your life. People can change, learn, grow, but only if they choose to do the work. What work? I'll never work in pharmaceuticals again. I'm unemployable. I'm the woman who racially profiled a CEO on a viral video. Right now, yes. But a year from now, 5 years from now. If you spend that time genuinely learning about the impact of your actions, doing the work to understand your biases, maybe finding ways to help others avoid your mistakes, that could be a different story. Victoria considered his words as the aircraft touched down at Heathrow. The immediate future was bleak career destroyed, family, disappointed reputation in ruins. But Dr. Torres was suggesting that even this catastrophic failure could become the beginning of something different, something better. Carmen Rodriguez, Victoria's former assistant, was already planning her new career trajectory. She had spent the flight networking with other passengers via social media, and several people had reached out about potential job opportunities. Her decision to resign immediately and distance herself from Victoria's behavior had been noted and respected by industry observers. Elena Carmen said, approaching the tech executive's seat as they prepared to disembark, I saw your live stream mention that you're hiring for corporate communications positions. I have experience in pharmaceutical marketing and crisis management. Elena smiled and handed Carmen her business card. "Send me your resume. Anyone smart enough to jump ship from that disaster before it fully exploded is someone I want on my team." As passengers began filing off the aircraft, Desmond made one final announcement to the cabin. Standing in the aisle near his seat 1A, which had started this entire confrontation, he addressed the group of people who had witnessed something unprecedented. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had characterized his behavior throughout the incident. "What happened on this flight today will likely be discussed for years to come. I hope it's remembered not as a moment of division, but as an opportunity for growth." He paused, looking around the cabin at faces that had become familiar over the 7-hour flight. We all have biases. We all make assumptions. The difference is whether we choose to examine those assumptions when they're challenged or double down when we're proven wrong. Victoria, gathering her belongings in seat 2, felt the words as both an indictment and an invitation. She had chosen to double down, to escalate rather than reflect, to assume the worst rather than consider alternatives. But Desmond's words suggested that this failure, devastating as it was, didn't have to be the end of her story. Margaret Foster, walking past Victoria's seat as she prepared to leave the aircraft, stopped and offered one final piece of teacher wisdom. "Child, you've got a choice to make. You can spend the rest of your life being angry about consequences, or you can spend it becoming someone who wouldn't have earned those consequences in the first place." As Victoria finally stood to leave the aircraft, she took one last look at seat 1A. The leather chair that had triggered her meltdown looked ordinary now, just airline furniture, nothing special or significant. But it had become the catalyst for industry change, career destruction, and potentially personal transformation. She walked past Desmond, who was speaking with Captain Hayes near the aircraft door. Both men nodded politely as she passed, offering the basic courtesy she had denied Desmond hours earlier. The contrast was not lost on her. "Ms. Pemberton Wells," Desmond called out as she reached the aircraft door. She turned back, expecting final judgment or parting criticism. "Good luck with whatever comes next," he said simply. "I hope you find what you're looking for." The words were genuine, without sarcasm or malice. Even after everything she had done, Desmond was offering her the dignity she had tried to deny him. It was the most devastating kindness she had ever received. As Victoria walked through the jet bridge toward the terminal, she knew that her old life was over. The question now was what she would build in its place, and whether she had the courage to do the work of becoming someone worthy of the second chance Desmond had implied was possible. Behind her, the other passengers disembarked into a world where the story of Flight 847 was already reshaping conversations about privilege, accountability, and the power of treating others with basic human dignity. 6 months later, Desmond Clark stood in the auditorium of the London School of Economics, addressing an audience of business students, industry leaders, and corporate executives who had gathered for the inaugural Clark Institute for Business Ethics Symposium. The morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating faces that were eager to hear from the man who had transformed a moment of personal attack into a catalyst for industry-wide change. "The question I'm asked most frequently," Desmond began, his voice carrying the same calm authority that passengers on Flight 847 had witnessed, "is whether I was angry during those 20 minutes. Whether I wanted revenge against the woman who tried to humiliate me in front of a cabin full of strangers." The audience leaned forward, hanging on every word. The Flight 847 incident had become legendary in business circles, a case study in leadership dignity under pressure and the power of strategic restraint. The truth is, I felt many things during that confrontation. Disappointment, certainly. Sadness at the assumptions being made about my worth as a human being. But anger, no. Because anger would have given her exactly what she wanted. It would have made me the problem rather than her behavior. In the audience, several familiar faces from Flight 847 were present. Elena Santos had flown in from Miami, where her tech company was now partnering with Meridian on diversity and inclusion software. James Mitchell was covering the event for the Financial Times, having parlayed his airline footage into a career as one of Europe's leading business journalists. Margaret Foster, the retired teacher, sat in the front row with tears in her eyes. At 73, she had lived through enough history to recognize when she was witnessing something truly significant. The young man who had maintained his dignity in the face of racial hatred was now reshaping how an entire industry thought about leadership and character. The real lesson of that day, Desmond continued, wasn't about airline seating or corporate mergers or social media virality. It was about the choice we make when our character is tested. Do we respond to hatred with hatred? Do we meet assumptions with our own assumptions? Or do we demonstrate that there's a better way? Sophie Williams, now Director of Executive Experience at Meridian Pharmaceutical, watched from the side of the auditorium with pride and gratitude. The job Desmond had offered her during the flight had transformed her career, but more importantly, it had taught her that workplaces could be built on respect rather than hierarchy. The symposium was live streaming to over 50,000 viewers worldwide, a reminder of how completely the world had changed since that day on Flight 847. Social media. Once the platform for Victoria's viral humiliation, was now spreading Desmond's message of dignity and transformation to a global audience eager for better leadership models. "I want to share something with you," Desmond said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a letter. "This arrived at my office last week, and it represents why I believe in the possibility of change." He unfolded the handwritten pages carefully, and those close enough could see that the paper trembled slightly in his hands, the first sign of emotion he had shown during the presentation. "It's from Victoria Pemberton Wells, the woman who confronted me on Flight 847. The auditorium fell completely silent. She's spending this year working with a non-profit organization that provides job training for formerly incarcerated individuals. She's learning about systemic inequality, unconscious bias, and the impact of privilege on decision-making. The letter had arrived unexpected, and unsolicited part of what Victoria had explained was her process of making amends for her behavior. She was working with a counselor, attending bias training workshops, and volunteering with organizations that served communities she had previously ignored or dismissed. She writes, "Mr. Clark, I know my apology cannot undo the harm I caused or the pain I inflicted. But I want you to know that every day I work to become someone who would have stood up for you rather than attacking you. I'm learning that privilege is a responsibility, not a right, and that dignity is something we owe to every human being we encounter." Elena Santos, watching via livestream from her Miami office, felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had documented Victoria's destruction in real time, had watched a woman's life implode in 20 minutes of viral video. But this was redemption made real. James Mitchell was taking notes, frantically recognizing that Desmond's willingness to share Victoria's letter was itself a form of leadership. He was modeling forgiveness without minimizing harm, accountability without abandoning hope for growth. "I share this," Desmond continued, "not because Victoria's journey absolves her of responsibility for her actions, but because it demonstrates that even our worst moments can become catalysts for becoming our best selves. The choice is always ours." Dr. Torres, watching from his hospital break room between surgeries, nodded with satisfaction. His conversation with Victoria during the flight about the work of change had apparently taken root. People could indeed transform themselves, but only through sustained effort and genuine commitment to growth. Carmen Rodriguez, now head of corporate communications at Elena's tech company, was live-streaming the event for her own social media followers. She had built a successful career by distancing herself from Victoria's toxic behavior, but she appreciated Desmond's willingness to acknowledge that even the worst people could potentially change. The Clark Institute has now partnered with 43 pharmaceutical companies to implement bias reporting systems, diversity leadership programs, and accountability structures that prevent discrimination from taking root in corporate cultures, Desmond announced. We've provided scholarships to over 200 students from underrepresented communities, and we've created internship programs that give young people opportunities they might never have had otherwise. The statistics were impressive, but the human stories were even more powerful. Students in the audience who had benefited from Clark Institute scholarships, executives who had implemented new policies in their companies, employees who had found the courage to report discrimination because reporting systems now existed and were taken seriously. Captain Hayes, who had requested early retirement following the Flight 847 incident, watched the live stream from his home in Surrey. He had never flown again after that day, realizing that his 20 years of aviation experience had culminated in presiding over a moment of perfect moral clarity. He was proud that his announcement had helped expose Victoria's behavior while elevating Desmond's leadership. But the most important change, Desmond said, approaching the conclusion of his presentation, happens one interaction at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of deciding to see the humanity in every person we encounter. He paused, looking out at the audience with the same calm expression that had characterized his response to Victoria's attacks 6 months earlier. I still fly regularly for business. I still prefer aisle seats when possible. And yes, I still occasionally encounter people who make assumptions about whether I belong in first class in boardrooms and spaces reserved for people they consider important. The audience chuckled, recognizing the ongoing reality of bias and discrimination that successful people of color navigated daily. The difference now is that more people are watching. More people are ready to speak up. More people understand that silence in the face of injustice is complicity with injustice. Margaret Foster began applauding, and the rest of the auditorium quickly joined her. But this wasn't the kind of applause reserved for entertaining performances. This was recognition, gratitude, and commitment to the work of creating better institutions and better communities. As the symposium concluded and attendees began networking and discussing implementation strategies, Desmond stepped outside onto the university's campus quad. The London afternoon was crisp and clear, and he found himself thinking about Seat 1, the leather chair that had started everything. His phone buzzed with a text message from Sophie Williams. Sir British Airways wants to offer you naming rights to Seat 1A on all their aircraft. Should I set up a meeting? Desmond smiled and typed back, No thanks. It's just a seat. Let's keep working to make sure everyone feels they belong in whatever seat they choose. He pocketed his phone and walked toward his car where his driver was waiting to take him to the airport. There was a flight to catch, business to conduct, and an industry to continue transforming one interaction, one choice, one moment of dignity at a time. The story of Flight 847 had ended with consequences and accountability, but it continued with hope growth and the possibility that even our worst moments can become the foundation for our best contributions to the world. And in nonprofit offices, university classrooms, and corporate boardrooms around the world, people were learning that true power doesn't come from demanding deference. It comes from extending dignity to others, especially when they don't deserve it.